Namaskar, Swagatam. We welcome you all to the Oneness Festival of Indica brought to you by Moksha. And today's talk is also in collaboration with Indica Center for Soft Power. We will start with a small prayer. Agajanana Padmarkam Gajanana Maharnisham Anekadantam Bhaktanam Ekadantam Upasmahe Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Pavatu Me Sada Ya Devi Stuyate Nityam Vibudairveda Parakaihi Same Vasatu Jihvagre Brahma Rupa Saraswati Sada Shiva Samarambham Shankara Acharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavadpadam Shankaram Loka Shankaram. We from the Center for Soft Power, we engage and do an amount of research, and we put out articles on our soft power, which encompasses more than 14 verticals, and Vedanta being one of them too. We have just started from the last month a series on the travel of ideas across the borders of India. We just did one with on Ayurveda with Dr. Mark Halpern and Dr. Ramkumar of Vaidyagram. And today we bring to you another very exciting event and talk, and it has a lot of depth and thought. Yes, Vedanta is universal, but the fountain came from Bharata. So I'll hand it over to Aparna now to introduce our speakers and take the session forward. Namaskar.
Namaste and good evening. We have three speakers today. I will start with Dr. Nagaraj Paturiji, who is Dean IKS of Advaita Academy. He's a senior professor with 3 decades of university teaching and research experience, including fieldwork-based cultural research. He specializes in culture studies, including folk culture studies, linguistics, including Sanskritam linguistics, literary studies, including myth studies. We have Fabio Milionigi. He was born in Rome, where he lived until a few years ago. He currently lives in Tunisia, where he continues the path of a wanderer and researcher of the traditional way, trying to get closer to the state of jignasa and as a sadhaka. We have Professor Long, Jeffrey Long. He is a professor of religion and Asian studies at Elizabethtown College, USA. His major specializations are in the field of Indian philosophy and traditions. He has authored many books and articles on dharmic traditions. So today morning, I was listening to a talk by Acharya Sthaneshwarji, and he was talking about how in the past our rishis and acharyas would always engage with thoughts and the texts, as well as practitioners of other traditions. And they were very much like maybe brothers. Even if they didn't agree, they would always engage and argue. And that is how our traditions did not grow in a vacuum, but in engagement with other practices and traditions. And that is why perhaps, which explains why when Indian traditions go abroad, they are welcomed, and there's always engagement with practitioners from other faiths, other paths. And we had the privilege of recording a talk yesterday between our 3 speakers, and we would like to play that for you today. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay, namaste. Welcome, Dr. Jeffrey Long and Yavyanya-ji. Namaste. As part of our month-long celebrations of Shankara Jayanti, we gave this celebration the name Global Festival of Oneness. We have been celebrating it for a month, and as part of that, today we have organized a discussion with two of you regarding the travel of spiritual ideas from India abroad. This discussion we are going to limit to the contemporary period only. We are going to discuss travel of spiritual ideas during modern times, 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. But before we start that conversation, I would like to give a historical overview of travel of spiritual ideas from India abroad. Recently, when we were discussing travel of knowledge systems from India abroad, I was proposing a study, a new field of study, a new discipline of study called comparative knowledge studies, so that we first identify cases for searching for travel of ideas. If there are similarities of knowledge systems, knowledge ideas, spiritual practices, cultural ideas, then that becomes a case for suspecting a travel. As it happens in cultural anthropology, which is essentially a comparative discipline, they first identify comparative cultural items and then decide whether there is a diffusion in the ideas from place to place or it is just a coincidence. In the same way, we can identify some spiritual ideas and practices which are found in India and elsewhere in the world and try to check if these are actually travel cases or not. One such case we can see is the case of the ancient world. Ancient world, as we all know, was not as isolated countries, isolated civilizations as we tend to think. We tend to imagine that only the present contemporary world is highly connected, it is globalized, there is globalization and all that. But probably we can think of an ancient globalization also in the ancient world. We have archaeological and other evidences of a great connectivity among Indian civilization, Egyptian civilization, South American civilizations like the Mayan, Inca, or Aztec, Mayan in the North America, Greco-Roman civilizations, Chinese civilizations. There are very good evidences of connections. And we can see that what was viewed by Abrahamic religions as pagan cultures also were not so isolated from each other. There was a possibility of connections among pagan cultures also. And all over the world in the departments of comparative religion, religious studies and history of religions, there is already a considered and established approach of identifying travel of ideas into Abrahamic religions from the Zoroastrian source. And the Zoroastrian source is already in a very established and considered way was connected to the Vedic culture. So through Zoroastrian, the connections of Vedic culture to the Abrahamic cultures is already at least a suspected travel of ideas. For example, what they usually term as monotheism, Ekeshwara Upasana, to use the Indian word, that is found in Zoroastrianism, and the what they call monotheism in Abrahamic religions is suspected to be an influence of Zoroastrian ideas of Zoroastrian travel. And there are studies on Sufism, for example, where there is a very strong hypothesis of Buddhist influence on Sufism, Advaitic influence on Sufism, and historians go to the extent of suspecting that the three Magi could be Indians. Three Magi in the Bible could be Indians. And there are historians who even suspect that the person who was encountered by Prophet Muhammad, from whom he got a spiritual inspiration, also because he is mentioned to have been traveling from the east, could be a traveler from a yogic traveler, a yogi from India. And all these are cases for hypothesis, and there are studies which are just at the level of hypothesis. There is a possibility. These are all possibilities, but very strong evidences of travel of ideas is found in the Greco-Roman world, where there are very strong suspicions of interaction between the Shrauta Sutras, particularly the Katyayana Shulba Sutras, and Pythagorean Euclidean mathematical geometrical ideas. And the Greco-Roman world as a Hellenistic world, as it is shown in the textbooks, was not just Aristotelian philosophy, poetics, mathematics, Euclid, and all that. For the surprise of the contemporary audience, they might want to know that Pythagoras was in fact a Devi kind of mother goddess worshipper. There are stories in his notes, at least alleged notes of Pythagoras, that his so-called Pythagoras theorem was to be discovered by him only after a commissioning by the king to renovate a temple of a certain goddess. And that goddess could be comparable to Devi or Shakti. And the comparable entities which were found in comparative mythology between Greco-Roman and Indian mythology, and similarities in sun cults all over the world, sun worship, which gets connected to Gayatri and Gayatri Mantra, Savita, Savitri Devata, all these, a very rich material is there for hypothesis of comparative studies giving scope for identification of similarities and a scope for searching for travel of ideas among them, which has to be established only through a different kind of a research. So that we can keep for another day, another time, for another talk, another conversation. For today, let us keep ourselves to the contemporary times. Professor Long, you are known for your interest in Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition and your interest in Jainism studies. Uh, from these perspectives, can you please throw light on whether it was the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement that started this kind of a known and established travel of ideas, or do you see that there was, even before Vivekananda's the famous Chicago address, there was there were happenings which actually were already laying foundation for such travel of ideas?
Yeah, it's very much the second, that the foundation was being laid. In fact, long before Swami Vivekananda went to the West, there had been a long-standing interest among some section of Western intellectuals in India, in Indian wisdom, in Indian spiritual traditions. There had long been a kind of subterranean Christianity, you might call it, a very old tradition that was outside of the mainstream, but that maintained certain practices and traditions and beliefs that were actually very, very old, and have very close affinities to what we find in Indian traditions, and perhaps the origins of these were in Indian traditions. And after the Protestant Reformation, some of these things come out more openly. One particular example I'm thinking of is the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who is known for his visionary descriptions of the process of rebirth and the afterlife, and his meditative practices that cultivated the kinds of visions that he has. And so you had various visionary figures within the West, and as colonization began, as the Western world began to explore the rest of the world and exploit the rest of the world, there were people in Europe who, and then eventually in North America, who had a great fascination for India and saw in India connections with many of these ideas that had been carried on from the Greeks and through and into the Christian tradition. And there was a very powerful moment, you could say, of a kind of self-critical moment within the West, which we see especially strongly starting in the early 19th century with the Romantic movement in Europe, for example, the idea that something had been lost in Western culture and in the transition into the modern world. And you see an emerging dissatisfaction with what come to be the two main ideologies of the West, which on the one hand is a very conservative form of Christianity, which is not particularly open to other traditions and to the rest of the world. And then you have the emergent scientistic and materialistic atheism emerging as a kind of reaction against Christianity. And with the Romantics and with later groups like the Transcendentalists and the Theosophists, you see a rebellion against both of these extremes of Western thought, that the old dogmatism of the church is being rejected, but at the same time, a rationality that doesn't allow for spirituality and for the deeper longings of the human soul is also deeply unsatisfactory. And so a growing number of people begin to see in India you could almost see a kind of remnant of an ancient wisdom that the West believed that it was losing, right? That was being lost in the West. And so you see this with the Romantics, and then again in America, specifically with the Transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and thinkers in their orbit began to absorb everything that they could find coming from India, whatever was being translated at that time. Translations began of texts like the Bhagavad Gita in the late 18th century, and these translations continued. Not very good translations, I think, by today's standards, but it was a beginning, it was an opening, and it was an understanding that in texts like the Gita, texts like the Upanishads, there was a wisdom that answered many of the questions that people were having in the West. And so as these movements develop, like Transcendentalism, and then you get the Theosophical Society in the later 19th century, they're laying the foundation for what Swami Vivekananda would then do in 1893. I would see his coming not as the beginning, but as a very important turning point, a kind of pivot point in which, rather than receiving this knowledge from books, a growing number of Westerners began to receive it directly from gurus, from teachers coming from India. And not only in the Ramakrishna Swami Vivekananda tradition, that's my tradition, it's the one I know best, but you have many others as well. In the early 20th century, there were representatives of bhakti traditions coming into America. Very famously in 1920, Paramahansa Yogananda comes and brings his practice of Kriya Yoga, and that becomes quite popular in the West. And then, of course, you get a backlash. In 1924, a law is passed in the United States called the Asian Exclusion Act to try to keep people from Asia, meaning India, meaning Japan, meaning China, keeping them out, right? That there is a sense that the defenders of the old social order in the West felt a threat coming from these traditions and from popular speakers like Swami Vivekananda. And I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but then you get another wave of interest in the 1960s with the counterculture and really mass discontent with the dominant thinking in the West. And I think we are still living today in the aftermath, if you will, of the 1960s, that many of the teachers, many of the traditions, the sampradayas that have come to the United States first came during that period in the 60s. And then you have, of course, the opening of the United States again to immigration from India. And so that, again, begins to change the landscape. But yes, long before Swami Vivekananda came, for at least a couple of centuries, there was a building interest in India, which really prepared the way and allowed there to be a receptive audience for Swami Vivekananda when he did come.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing this up. I'll come back to you with questions about Daroshiko, Persian translations and their travel and their influence on the Western philosophers like Nietzsche and others and all that. Fabiano ji, with your interest in yoga, actually your interest started with your interest in yoga basically. And in your own understanding, do you think that the travel of yoga to the Eastern European areas like Greece, Italy, and other places, is it recent in your generation, in your younger days, or was there a background to that even earlier to you discovered yoga there?
Well, I'll try to explain something a little bit different. We must split the situation in Italy and Europe between what happens in university, what happens with the large public, what happens in Vedanta and yoga. Those are the elements, the facts. Otherwise, I lose something before we go to yoga. Well, first of all, university. There is an old tradition of a connection between Italian philosophers and Indian. I just refer to Sundaranath Dasgupta when he met the philosophers in Italy. It was very important. Up to now, in all the major Italian universities, there are departments of Indology, Tibetology and Indology, Tibetology and Indology, Tibetology and Indology, Tibetology and Indology, 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 Tibetology and Indology. Obviously, there is also Sanskrit. But the problem is no department dedicated to Vedanta, or more correctly, to Sanatana Dharma. And this is a key point due to the fact we have emeritus professors like Carlo Della Casa, Raniero Agnoli, Federico Scorcini, Raffaella Turella. We are very, very good professors, but their approach is not a Vedantic and Sanatana Dharma approach. They are mostly influenced by the Kashmir Shivaism, Buddhism, and so on. What is the problem? They tend to interpret the Vedanta and Sanatana Dharma from the point of view of Buddhism, Jainism, or Shivaism. And this is the level of the academic approach. If we go to the book available in Italian, well, first of all, we have a great problem. Sanskrit in itself is untransferable. Secondly, most of the books are translated in English. So the double translation is misleading. On the other hand, it's not coming from the academic field, but we in Italy, we have the full set of the Vedanta texts translated directly from Sanskrit into Italian from a quite unknown author, which is Raphael. And editions of Ashram Media, it's a group of tradition, they translated all the Vedanta texts with the comments of Shankaracharya. So in principle, those are available. For whom? And now we come to yoga. Unfortunately, yoga is literally gymnastic, more or less. It's not the real yoga. I think it is adapted to the Western European people on the assumption that the basics of yoga, which are yama niyama, are rejected. And they are rejected due to the fact Indian gurus said that for Western people, we must adapt and we must. The question arises, how do you can become a yogi or a Vedanti if you reject all the principles, the duties of yama and niyama, which are quite similar to what happens in Vedanta. And now I would like to introduce another concept. Yoga Darshana is one of the 6 Darshana. Vedanta is another. Uttara Mimamsa and Mimamsa. And so all the other. But the 6 Darshana are to be considered as astika, as orthodox systems that are all within the big complex of the Sanatana Dharma, which has in Italy, in Europe, a quite similar concept, which is not exoterical. It's esoterical. It is the perennial philosophy, which belongs to in our heritage, we have the sort of list of Parmenides, Pythagoras, Plato, Plotin, up to Themistoplaton. This is the tradition which is out of the university, but which still exists. In this tradition, it's recognized that all is one. The tradition is one. That means there are different visions of the same traditions. It's the same if we talk about yoga or Vedanta, we respect the Sanatana Dharma. So, where is the problem? Now, in Italy, I assume in the West. Each tradition is valid in itself, in its purity, in its wholeness. That doesn't mean that we can talk with the others. We can talk with Kabbalists. But it's up to you to choose your way. If you choose one way, you have to follow it as a whole. You can split. If you take yoga as a small part, it's not yoga. I think, related to yoga, that there are two great problems. The yoga, from my point of view, as yoga darshana, is the Patanjali yoga. Then there is the Hatha yoga, which is outside, is another tradition. But obviously, it's very useful to refer to the Hatha yoga texts to play yoga. But the real yoga is the yoga of Patanjali. And the yoga of Patanjali is one. When also the great Indian gurus and masters and saints like Shivananda, Chidananda, Krishnananda, and others talk about Raja Yoga, I understand the meaning. But yoga in itself, it's all. If you look inside the Yoga Sutra, you find all. It's sufficient to look inside the Yama Niyama, and you find the Kriya Yoga, Raja Yoga, and it's all. Well, coming to the West, the problem for the general public is terrible. Yoga is a merchandise. It's something to be sell out. But there's nothing to see with yoga. Nothing. And it's very difficult. And the problem is also for the people who teach yoga. From my point of view, I have a degree. Theoretically, I'm a yoga teacher. But it's misleading. Up to now, I'm still working on the basics of yoga. I'm not able to go to the side yoga. Pratyahara actually is my wall. I have to open this door. But if we try to put this to the people, they say, no, I want to meditate. Most of people think that they can meditate. It's not meditation. It's not meditation. Well, I have a lot of problems, but another thing, in all the West, for sure in Italy, there are many people who are trying to find the truth. And in all the Occident, in the West, in Italy, and not only, there is a big problem. Our tradition has lost its practice. We lost the chain. The parampara is lost. So theoretically we have the test. What to do? We don't know. The risk is to remain at a level of theoretical level. And that's the reason for which the Sanatana Dharma as a whole is for us a great tool to be followed, because the Sanatana Dharma feed us with the method, with the instruments, and we can sweet instruments. A great Western thinker, René Guénon, at the start of the 19th century, wrote many books. He was very interested in Vedanta, the pure Vedanta. And he said that the West can solve its problem, probably, and he was not sure, if we refer to Vedanta. to the East, and particularly to India, to Bharat, because, he said, they have not lost the chain. And that's the big problem for us.
Okay. That was really very interesting. You have a very critical take on how it has gone to Italy and how it is actually being followed in Italy. You are looking for a holistic practice rather than very partial or sectarian side of it. With the help of people like you, I am hopeful that holistic tradition will be definitely revived, Fabiano ji. Professor Long, you have been working on Jainism also, along with Vedanta from the Ramakrishna perspective. So, when do you think that tradition started traveling to United States or the West?
So I think, well, if I can refer very briefly to the ancient period, which you covered so nicely earlier, I suspect a Jain influence very early in the West, and the place, and this is a wild hypothesis that I have. I need to do much more study to verify this, but it's an intuition I have. There is a tradition called in the West Manichaeism, which was believed for a long time by Christian thinkers to be a Christian heresy. And scholars eventually realized that, in fact, no, this was a completely separate tradition, but which often took on the form of the other traditions that surrounded it. So Manichaeism looks very Buddhist in China, for example, but it has more of a Christian aspect in the West. But its basic belief is that there are two fundamental types of reality. There is the light and the darkness. And the light has, in effect, been invaded by the darkness. The light is trying to free itself from the darkness. And a path is laid out by which this can occur. This is basic Jain teaching. It's also basic Sankhya, if you think about it, because the light is referring to what the Jains called the jiva, or what in Sankhya and yoga is called the purusha, that is, broadly speaking, spirit in English, or consciousness. And then there's matter, right, the material world. And the Manichaeans tell a complex story of how the material substance has come to infiltrate the spiritual substance. And the practice of Manichaeism is all about freeing the spiritual substance from that material substance. Again, that is the Jain tradition as well. And the specifics are the same also. The Manichaeans taught nonviolence, they taught vegetarianism, and they had a subgroup within the tradition who were renouncers, people who were monastics, people who did not work in the ordinary sense, but who dedicated themselves to the path of nonviolence and to showing this to others. So I think it's very likely that Manichaeism is a Western form of Jainism, that at some point, likely, I think, post-Alexander, you have some Jain thinking and some Jain practice coming into the West. And Professor Paduri, as you said so well earlier, we tend to think of globalization as something recent. In fact, it's just faster now, but we've always had globalization. And as you say, when we see strong resemblances between ideas, if we can show the possibility of transmission, and we haven't proven it, but we've at least taken a step toward suggesting that this has occurred. And there are a number of features of Manichaeism that I think are strikingly similar to Jainism. There's the metaphysical and cosmological vision I just very briefly alluded to. There's also the tendency to draw maps of the cosmos and diagrams based on the relationship of matter and spirit in various realms. And this is also present in the Jain tradition, the very complex Lokapurusha image, right, that portrays the various levels of the cosmos. And so I suspect there was a very early infiltration of Jain ideas and practices into the West. And this continued up into medieval Europe because the medieval descendants of the Manichaeans were a group called the Cathars, the Cathari, who lived in southern France, and they continued their nonviolent practices, their practices of vegetarianism, and then they were wiped out by a crusade that was launched by the poorly named Pope Innocent III, who sent this war against the Cathars and wiped them out and appropriated all of their land. So that's the early story, I believe. But again, I'm not saying that it's proven that Manichaeism was a form of Jainism. I think there are a lot of elements that are very suggestive that are worth further study. In the modern period, the first Jain whom I'm aware of, and that's an important thing to underscore. There may have been others that are less known, but at the same time that Swami Vivekananda came to the US and spoke at the Parliament of World Religions, a man named Virchand Gandhi came to speak at the same parliament as a representative of the Jain tradition. He came because his guru, who was a Jain mendicant, and because of the rules of Jain mendicancy, he could not travel abroad, but he delegated Virchand Gandhi to take his teaching and come to the West, and Virchand Gandhi did, and in fact he won over a number of converts to the Jain tradition. Probably the best known is a man named Herbert Warren, who wrote a book called Jainism in Modern Guise as a Solution to the World's Problems. And it's a thin little book, but it's a summary of the teachings of the Jain tradition as presented by Virchand Gandhi to Warren. So that he was the first Jain that I'm aware of to have come to the West. Then you get growing numbers, a few in the early 20th century, but then again there is that Asian Exclusion Act in 1924, which really prevents much further immigration. But after the civil rights legislation in 1964, the Asian Exclusion Act is lifted, and then people can come from India and immigrate to the US, and among them have been quite a few Jains, most involved in business professions. And the growth of the Jain community has been such that, here's an interesting fact which a Jain friend of mine in Philadelphia informed me about a few years ago. There are apparently as many Jains per square mile in the state of New Jersey as there are in the state of Gujarat in India. Now, Gujarat has many more square miles than New Jersey, so in terms of, if we if we put each Jain in 1 square mile, the distribution would be the same. So there are growing number of Jain temples in the U.S. In the early years, that is late 60s, early 70s, Jains made alliances with Hindus in the U.S. because the dharmic communities were very, very small. So it made sense if you wanted to build a temple, if you wanted to have a mandir, if you wanted to have a place of worship and meditation, you would work with other people of similar background. And so there are a number of Hindu Jain temples. There's the Hindu Jain temple of Pittsburgh. There's a Hindu Jain temple. There's several of them in New Jersey. The temple that I'm a member of near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, is a Hindu Jain temple. There is a murti of Mahavira. He is honored alongside the various Hindu devatas, and the Jain holy days are celebrated at the temple with as much enthusiasm as the various Hindu holy days. So in our area, the Jain community is in effect a subset of the broader dharmic community. And the Hindu Temple Society of Allentown, Pennsylvania, in fact, it has places within the temple for all 4 dharma traditions. There's a Hindu altar with Hindu murtis. There's a Buddhist altar, there's a Jain altar, and then there's the Guru Granth Sahib, also for the Sikh tradition. And these are all kept there and in places of honor. And so Jains have been part of that wider dharmic community, mostly of immigrants coming from India. And then as the numbers have grown, you see more and more independent Jain centers, Jain temples, like the Jain Center of New York, or Siddhachalam, also in New Jersey, where I've spoken a number of times. So as the Jain community grows in numbers, they are able to strike out on their own, as it were, and have their own institutions that aren't necessarily tied to Hindu institutions. But the Hindu Jain temples also continue to thrive and to be an important part of the landscape here.
Okay, thank you very much for that very elaborate and detailed presentation. And nowadays it seems Jainism studies seem to be picking up
Yes.
in the academia also, more than earlier. Earlier it used to be a domination by Buddhism studies. Now Jainism studies are also picking up. Fabiano ji, what we hear from India about both Greece and Italy is that new pagan, neo-pagan movements are picking up in both these countries. And there are revivals of old Greco-Roman temples, Greco-Roman goddess and god temples. Using modern technology also, they are coming up with such temples. Do you see any connection between or networks that are developing between the interest in Indic traditions, Sanatana Dharma traditions, as you are rightly insisting on that word? Are there any connections between these groups and groups who are interested in Vedanta, yoga, and other Sanatana Dharma traditions?
For sure, in Italy there is a great interest. The problem is very fragmented. The fragmentation creates non-communicability between the various agents. And this is the first one. The second one is the problem of the so-called yoga teacher training. Due to the fact, actually, most of people who like yoga, who want to know yoga and address themselves to the school, it's very difficult for them to find a real training in which Vedanta is teaching. I was happy with the fact that the Italian Yoga Federation, the yoga course, which lasted 3 years, included Vedanta.
Oh.
The philosophy was dedicated to Vedanta, exclusively to Vedanta. And what to do? Well, it's very difficult with the fact that the market is dominant. But on the other hand, we are open to an exchange of thinking between different cultures on the axiom of the full respect of the fullness of each cultural identity. And here we found another problem, which is the syncretism. Today it's very easy to make cocktails, taking something here, something here, something here. And as my guru, Ananda Yogi, said clearly, there is a problem of cultural misappropriation. How many Western thinkers take from Vedanta, from Sanatana Dharma, key concepts, key ideas, and use them as a tool to be something different without saying which are the roots, which are the reference. And in our economy, this is very easy due to the fact that the libraries are they need new book with new idea to be sold. This is a big problem. if we go to a typical Greek library in Italy, it's very difficult to find the Vedanta text. Also, if they exist, but you can find them. You found beautiful girls in beautiful poses, and I think the problem is up to us, but in some extent, it's also a problem for you. You have the
Do
mastery.
you think this not
So,
acknowledging?
from India.
Yeah. Do you think this not acknowledging is because because of lack of reception? If it is acknowledged that it is from India or if it is from Sanatana Dharma, is there an opposition? Is there a resistance to such a reception there?
No, absolutely not. We are, in principle,
Okay.
we are free. And the problem is that we can also distribute the sources. For example, we listed all the 7 sources, and everyone can choose. And this is very important.
Okay. So
To
this
an
not
extent,
acknowledging is out of dishonesty.
No,
This
no,
is
no.
just dishonesty.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, we can use it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Professor Long, after Vivekananda, the Shankara tradition, the Advaita Vedanta tradition, has many more gurus traveling there, including Swami Dayananda Saraswati, and there is a very big reception also for these ideas. So, did you make a study or survey of Advaita Vedanta traditions, various Advaita Vedanta traditions that have come to US now, and the reception of that both in the academia and the general American population?
Yes, there are a number of Advaita traditions in the U.S. And as you mentioned, Swami Dayananda Saraswati and his center at Arsha Vidya Gurukulam, which is very, very highly regarded by many people. And then, of course, there is Swami Vivekananda's tradition is still going strong. I'd say within our tradition, one of our more vocal and well-known teachers is Swami Sarvapriyananda. He's sort of become a bit of a
Yes.
celebrity now on YouTube.
Yeah, very popular. Yes.
Yes, and very privileged to say a good friend of mine running the New York Vedanta Center. There's the Chinmaya Mission, which also has roots in Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta, I think, is very highly regarded because there is. And of course, I know there are people who will disagree strongly with what I'm about to say, but there is a certain non-sectarian character that it has. Right? It is not about revering a particular spiritual figure, a particular deity. If you don't follow our deity, you're wrong, and there's a problem. There's a very scientific quality about Advaita Vedanta. There's a rationality to it. It can be, of course, and of course, this has been debated among various scholars. There is the Shabda Pramana and the importance that Shankaracharya traditionally gives to the Shabda Pramana. But you also have texts like the Paroksha Anubhuti, where the realization of self comes through self-analysis and through a process which any intelligent being can engage in. And so that idea that anyone in principle can have this realization through, of course, the proper preparation and practice, there is something science-like about that, right? I mean, we are not all astrophysicists, but there is nothing inherently barring me from studying the books and enrolling in a program and learning the practices by which I would become an astrophysicist. In the same way, this knowledge of Advaita Vedanta, as it's been promulgated in the West, is something that anyone can, if they're serious and they're diligent, can do. So that's very appealing in the Western world. Of course, the danger we run is of making it seem easier than it is. This is one of the things, the beautiful things about Advaita Vedanta is that on the one hand, it's self-evident. On the other hand, it's very difficult to reach that point where that self-evident nature shines forth. I think rather like the world of yoga, we also have, I'm not going to name any names, but there are people who will sometimes bring out teachings under the banner of non-duality or non-dualism that are, more or less sort of, sort of repetitions of various psychological theories. And so, I mean, they're not really grounded in the text or the tradition or that deeper understanding. But there are many of these teachers who are also very good. And this is one of the issues that I think sometimes comes up also in the world of yoga, that on the one hand, there are those of us who do want to honor the traditional sources, the Indian sources, the text, because this is important knowledge. And why reinvent the wheel? This has already been developed to a very high degree in the tradition. But there are also people who, I think, with good intention, want to emphasize the universality of these truths, right? That it is sanatana, right? That it is something that is everywhere, that is all pervading. The risk then, of course, is in downplaying the Indic sources. And again, why cut off your own hand, right? Why not avail oneself of this very profound knowledge that is there? And again, all kinds of motivations come up as well. And this can even happen to people, I think, who begin very sincerely, but then becoming a teacher, then people start saying, oh, you're such a wonderful teacher. And then the ego emerges, and pretty soon you have a problem, right? Someone wants to copyright vijnana, and that's just not possible. So we have those kinds of issues, I think, that arise in Advaita. But yeah, I've seen the appeal of Advaita being greater for many Americans who are drawn to these things than more, say, maybe overtly theistic traditions like Vaishnava traditions and so on, which are also wonderful traditions which attract many people, but they are sometimes seen as some kind of sectarian, right? So for people coming mostly from a Christian background, they say, oh, you've just replaced Jesus with Krishna, right? What's the difference, right? And so Advaita Vedanta is doing something different, and I think that's why I think also people find it not threatening in that sense, because one can approach it from a rational perspective, and it isn't seen necessarily as there's this word religion, right, which has caused all kinds of problems in the world, and it's not seen necessarily as a religion, and that means people don't think they necessarily have to give up their whole sense of identity in order to practice this. Of course, ultimately, it ends up transforming your sense of identity thoroughly, but that's not a precondition, right, of taking up the practice. Unlike, say, back in the 60s and 70s, when in the ISKCON tradition, for example, I mean, you basically had to dress and behave like a 14th century Bengali Vaishnava in order to practice the tradition. And in America, that was sort of seen as very unconventional, and it alienated people from their families and so on. I don't see Advaita Vedanta doing that. I mean, it's very... I think it's almost impossible to be fanatical about Advaita Vedanta. It militates against this type of thinking. And so things that might make your average American uncomfortable about an exotic or foreign tradition are not so much present, I think, with Advaita Vedanta.
Yamini, same question to you. How about reception of Advaita Vedanta or Shankara tradition in your own circles, or in general in Italy or East European parts? Shankara Vedanta and Advaita Vedanta.
Let me say, in Italy, Vedanta is equalized to Shankara Vedanta. Due to the fact that the books on which we can study in Italian are all the texts, the Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, and so on, with the Shankara commentary. So, and there is another element. Shankaracharya is seen as sort of India. And that's the reason for which Shankaracharya in itself is very, very useful. Also in his text, apart from the commentary to Upanishads, obviously for advanced students, it's not easy. It's not easy from one side, and on the other side, Upanishads is a life-lasting study. You can stop, you finish, and you restart. But on the other end, there are the minor for just for the dimensions text of Shankaracharya, which are fundamental. Like children, for example, we try to disseminate those books also for free and try to teach them drop by drop. And absolutely, there is a great positive approach and attitude in Italy from the philosophical or existential point of view, sociological as well, to approach the Vedanta through Shankaracharya, for sure.
Oh, thank you very much. Professor Long, with regard to the travel of ideas that we were talking, was there a proper Shankara works like Bhashyas or even later literature getting translated into English and traveling to United States or the other Western areas that was happening before Swami Vivekananda, maybe by Persian translation times, or even later to Swami Vivekananda. Vivekananda seems to be a threshold before and after we can see. So how good is this travel of translation works into English as per your understanding?
Right. So, in terms of if we speak broadly of Vedanta, we think of the Upanishads, for example. Of course, those came fairly early. There was, of course, the Persian translation, later rendered into Latin, and then that eventually rendered into French and German and Italian and English and other European languages. Those did not include Shankaracharya's commentaries, and very often, one thinker that's often mentioned in this connection is Arthur Schopenhauer, and he's sometimes criticized for his interpretation of the Upanishads. But I always like to point out that he was working with a translation of a translation of a translation. So if we take that into account, I think he did a pretty good job. And people might accuse me of being partisan for saying this, but some of the best scholarly translations of Shankara's commentaries have come from the Swami Vivekananda tradition, from the Advaita Ashrama publishers, and from translators and commentators like Swami Vireshwarananda, for example, who, full disclosure, is my Param Guru, but he was a brilliant translator of the Shankara Bhashyas on the Brahma Sutras, on Shankara's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, many of the translations of the Upanishads themselves have been done by Swamis who were part of this tradition. Swami Gambhirananda, for example, did quite a few translations of the principal Upanishads. And I think that is where a lot of that work has been done. Interestingly, among scholars, this whole field of research has seemed to have fallen out of fashion among many because I don't know. I mean, there are all kinds of trends that happen in scholarship, and there was a time when the sort of textual scholarship started to sort of fall out of fashion. There are scholars who are now again looking at these. There was a scholar from Yale who has done a I think, very nice translation and commentary on the Brahma Sutras. It's not coming from an Advaita perspective. It's coming from sort of modern academic perspective. But they're looking at the text, right? They're taking it seriously and bringing it back into the conversation. But in terms of the translations that are most in circulation, they are the ones from the Ramakrishna Mission for the most part.
Okay. Fabiani, how about Italy? Do you think that the translations into Italian come from English first? They get translated into English and then get into Italian? Or is Ramakrishna Math also active there? Or all these Archemat publications available there? Or Chinmaya Mission or Dayananda Saraswatis?
Yes, there are some translations and documents, but not so much in Italian. On the other hand, there is the Centro Studi Bhakti Vedanta in the Vedanta organizations. There are 3 or 4, but as far as the translation, I come back, what I said before, the translation made by the group of Ashram India are very, very good, due to the fact are by people who had the experiential approach. So they are not only experts, they are living Vedanta. And they have had the opportunity to translate what is untranslatable due to the fact that they live it from the initiated point of view. So they had the opportunity to have the feeling of the Sanskrit words in their deep meaning. And that only if you are uninitiated. Obviously, those people also take reference to other translation in English. But basically it was made upon the original texts available. And in my very small experience, I don't speak Sanskrit. But as far as I can able to go a little bit beyond, I can understand the meaning of the Sanskrit text from within. It's not just an intellectual approach. It's an existential one.
Before we wind up, I would like to ask both of you about the interaction from your own respective countries of people with the actual deep practitioners in the deeper forest areas or Himalayas or hills in the southern part in Tamil Nadu, where the actual practitioners are not seen to be highly learned scholars or Pithadipatis or Mathadipatis. So they are just looked at as some sadhu, some yogi with beard and hair and all that. So the what are the views or actual understanding of people of traveling to India to actually meet these people, live with them, learn from them, and all that? There could be some exotic, exaggerated, legendary stories and narratives about these people also. But what is the general trend about this traveling to India for this knowledge?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Fabian is
Okay.
here.
Some years ago, I tried to make an application form for the Shivananda in Rishikesh. But you see, unfortunately, it's only for Indians. You can't reach the real. That's the real question, due to the fact that the Sivananda Ashram in Rishikesh is the only institution, as far as I know, in which you can be learned deeply in Vedanta locally. Otherwise, I have every day I have access via internet to the other Indian sites when I can bring a lot of papers studied. But to go there, especially specifically for Vedanta, in my opinion, I don't know. On the other hand, most of the people which want to go to India is very easy. It's a vacation, a sophisticated vacation. It's another problem. Most of them are women. Few men follow Vedanta here. And sometimes I try to explain. Listen, in the Indian culture, there are also the Acharya, the warriors. So you want to be trained, we can work on the Acharya aspect. Mostly are women. And it's very, very, very difficult for the yoga teacher that have the approach also to learn a little bit of Sanskrit or Vedanta, or let me say simply Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, to people. They say, no, I'm here for asanas, or otherwise I would like to make meditation suddenly, in a snapshot. I try to give them little drops. Personally, I don't perform any economical activity with yoga. It's just a retransmission. I had the opportunity to something, and I see that it's my duty to retransmit just at the level in which I am. That's the reason for which I prefer never talk of what I think, but just to suggest what the real gurus say.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Long. Yeah.
Yes, I probably more than generalizing, I can maybe share a couple of personal anecdotes about this. It's my view that I at least have had some experiences in India that I think I could only have had there. Where these people have been doing this kind of sadhana, this practice, I mean, there is, at the risk of sounding, new agey, as they say, there's an energy that has permeated the place. That I think really, and I think people who come from the West, often I think we're very challenged by it. I think sometimes people may come seeking something and they think it's going to be easy. You pay something to somebody and you go on a nice retreat and you meditate and you have some great experience. But to me, the worthwhile experiences have always been the difficult ones, where I really had to challenge myself to, even though I was already, I think, very open to India and Indian ideas, there are ways you have to step outside of your Western conditioning when you're spending time in India. And even where I am now here in Japan, it's from a material perspective of quite luxurious, but it's culturally quite different. And I know that this place too, where I'm physically located right now, people have been practicing Zen. Zen is the Japanese for the Chinese Chan, which goes back to dhyana. This has been practiced here for centuries, and you can tell it's had an impact on the society and on the mannerisms of people, even people who themselves aren't necessarily practitioners. So I see that in India too, and I've several friends, a number of friends who are sadhus now, who are Westerners who went to India initially on this kind of quest. And just in the interest of time, I'll just share one story. I have many more. We would take another hour to share them. But there's one man that I know who went to India, not in fact for a spiritual purpose. He just went on a vacation. He wanted to see something different. So he went to India and he was hiking in a certain area with some friends and came to a small hut where there was a man, and the man spoke no English, but he gestured to them to come and sit with him. and he was reading from a text. He was singing it, chanting it, and my friend didn't know this at the time, but it was the Gita. It was the Bhagavad Gita. And what impressed my friend was he said he never met anyone in his life who was so obviously happy, who was so full of joy. And he's poor. He just has this little hut and this book that he's reading. That is just he's wanting to share this with these foreigners, even though they can't understand a word he's saying. But the joy of it came through. And this friend of mine, before he went to India for a vacation, before he left, he went to Belur Math and joined the Ramakrishna order and became a Swami. So what was to be a couple of weeks ended up being several years, and he's a sadhu, and he just had this chance encounter that transformed his life. So I think things like that, I think, could happen anywhere, but I think they're more likely to happen in a place like India, where that energy is just present, and despite colonization, despite all the things that have happened, it's still very much part of the culture, and so I see that. And there was an American journalist, Chris Matthews, a few years ago. He sort of fell from grace because of something he said a few years ago, but I remember hearing him give a report after he'd been on a short visit to India. And he verbalized something that I had also noticed as well. He said, even the way ordinary people walk, there's a certain gracefulness to it that we don't have in the Western world. We just kind of thunder along. But, you're aware that you're in a place that has had a civilization for thousands and thousands of years, and that has impressed itself on everyone, every child, every man and woman. So I think nothing can really replace that. And I think there will always be seekers who will come to India. The seekers, I'm thinking now, need to mind their manners. They need to respect the place they're going to. But I think this is something that is still important to a lot of people, that you need to go and have the experience more than reading about it or watching a YouTube video.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was very happy to note that SOVA's project on yoga also, recently they included ethnographic studies, moving away from the traditional conventional textual studies that they were doing. Some woman there is engaging herself in ethnographic studies. That's a good approach. Then only they will be able to study all these poor hut dwelling, remote corner, village dwelling, forest dwelling yogis and their way of living and actual practice of yoga, whether you call it hatha yoga or kriyas or all these deeper practices, mostly breath control related practices, and some of them are into Kundalini yoga also. All these they would be able to see only through such ethnographic cultural studies, rather than the textual studies probably is getting exhausted almost.
Yes.
So thank you very much, both of you, for giving us your own perspectives and experiences and sharing the vast area of traveler spiritual ideas from India to your own respective places. That was wonderful. I thank in behalf of Indica Moksha, Indica, and all Bharatiyas and all Sanatana Dharmanusaris. Thank you very much.
That was a truly wonderful 70 minutes that we spent with the three of you. I have a question, since we have only about 10 minutes left for the session, which is already, especially today, increased to 90 minutes instead of the normal 60 minutes in the Oneness Festival. This is a common question to both of you, Professor Long and Fabianiji. Do you think that now that we are in the Oneness Festival and we are talking about Advaita, what aspect of our spirituality or our practices do you think will help solve global issues today? Do you think there is a solution, and do you think it will come from the practice of any of our Indian spiritual traditions that have percolated around the world?
Fabio, would you like to speak first, or? Okay, so yes, in fact, one of the things that has drawn me to my own practice, but also to teaching and speaking about these traditions, is precisely my deep conviction that if humanity is going to survive much longer, we need to adopt on a very large scale many elements of the traditions of India. And because time is short, I'll just give one brief example. But the teaching in Advaita Vedanta of the oneness of existence, that we are all really one cosmic self, one Paramatman, this, if we take it seriously, if we make it the basis of our daily practice, has a great capacity to cultivate empathy. I begin to see others not as other, but as part of myself, and could no more harm them than I could harm myself, right? To hurt another would be like cutting off my own hand, right? And so this idea of empathy emerging from oneness, from non-duality, I think is something we need very, very deeply, because all the way from nations down to the family, we see that people are not communicating. They're not showing empathy for the other. They're only thinking of me, my interests, my concerns, or my people, my group, not seeing the whole. And there's a vision of wholeness in the Indic traditions. And Advaita Vedanta is a wonderful example, but we see this also in the Jain tradition. We see this in multiple traditions. And so I think empathy, karuna, compassion, ahimsa, not wishing to harm others. I mean, these are all, I think, essential to the survival of human beings.
Thank you. Yes, Fabianaji.
Well, it's a very, very deep and interesting question, and very, very critical. I try to give you two levels of the answer. The first one is the esoterical one, the initiated one, with the words of Ananda Balayogi, who say, "Do your best and leave the rest." Individually, we can also do our best every day, every moment of our life. And the key point is ahimsa, the non-harmless for every living creature, not only human. And that's what we can say and what we can share at the initiated level. Due to the fact, in addition, we are deep in the Kali Yuga. So we cannot see if we are at the end of the cycle before another one. Then, as far as the initiated point of view, we can only add one word: silence. The karma and the kriya of silence. And everyone know what has to do. On the other hand, let me add also an exoterical answer, due to the fact we are living also in the growth level, and we are emerging. And we can explain to the others, and we do that all is written by the Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, which ends with a war, ends with a battle. And we are to accept this. But there is an important thing. We trust in this moment in India, due to the fact Bharata represents worldwide the only reference point to solve the humanity problems. And Bharata is accepted by us also the most useful mean. When we learn the speech of your foreign policy ministers, we heard that he based his work on the Bhagavad Gita. He said that. And you, Bharata, have the responsibility to help the rest of humanity due to the fact that the humanity is not only the West. In Europe, we are not the humanity. The problem of the European people are not the problem of the humanity. But it's very difficult to explain to European people, to Western people, that we are not anymore the center of the world. In this approach, Vedanta is very useful. It's a scientific method. It's sufficient to remember the first two slokas of the Drisha Viveka. Think, just think. You look at something. You are something, you are the seeker, the other is seen. And then you arrive to a certain point in which if you think, we are all one. That's what we can share with all the people we meet and explain. We are all one. Everything we do against the other is against ourselves. But this is also the mission of the Christian religion. Do to the others what you want to be in yourself. And also in the initial initiatic tradition, which still exists in Italy and in Europe, are very wide disseminated, is the same principle. The fact that you must love the others. Love is the unique point of common point. But it's difficult.
Thank you. Yes, with oneness, we don't see the other. That's the only small line of difference there. So I will hand it over to Aparna since we are running out of time. And I think the topic that we took is more for a day-long or month-long symposium because there are so many interesting angles to this. We actually had a few more questions, but I think we'll do a part 2 travel of ideas of Vedanta. So we can get the rest of the questions that are just pouring out of us. So I'll hand it over to Aparna now and then we'll end with the prayer.
Thank you so much, Professor Long and Shri Fabio Milionici, for your time and your wisdom. Any questions that were not answered today, please come back tomorrow morning. We have another guest from the United States, a very good friend of Indic Academy, Babaji Bob Kindler. He will speak on Brahmapada, how seamless awareness disports on 4 feet. Indic Academy has published 2 of his books. You can get them, Footfalls of Indian Rishis. And he will be speaking tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Indian Standard Time. So please, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will end with a small prayer. Namaste.
Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamasorma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vasishyate Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om. Thank you all. And with your permission, we will be ending the session now.